thank you all for joining us here today. Especially in these times with so many video calls, it's appreciated that you would take the time to jump on another one. And just to engage overall, just having interest in aquaculture and especially investing in the economic side of aquaculture. As we were just discussing, people are filing on, just the fact that people are talking about this is great, and any interest is wonderful. So to get it all started, this webinar is, as you can see here, brought to you by the Maine Aquaculture Association, along with a partnership with the Maine Angels and the Coastal Enterprises Incorporated, and through sponsorship with Focus Maine. So for anyone unfamiliar with us, I know we have guests from all over the place on this. The Maine Aquaculture Association, we're a nonprofit trade association, and we represent, of course, the Maine aquaculture industry, but also at the state, federal, and international levels. We're doing work with people like Carole and Jonathan all the time, who do a lot of work at the national level, especially as well. Our members grow finfish, shellfish, sea vegetables, pretty much everything. And we've been doing this since 1978, working to support Maine's aquatic growers in developing economically and environmentally sustainable business practices, including promoting the benefits of aquaculture in the local food system and a vibrant working waterfront. And to try to get to Carole as soon as we can, as Sebastian has put it, today's webinar will consist of going through a series of presentations, followed by a Q&A, and of course this is all on investing and financing aquaculture. And the materials we'll go over, which again were funded in partnership with Focus Maine, the work itself that we're going over, include an overview of the aquaculture sector, which will be provided by Sebastian, and then the first of their kind financial benchmarking studies looking at the Maine aquaculture sector, along with just briefly going over some business planning tools we've created that are specific to aquaculture in Maine. And all these studies and work are pertaining to aquaculture in a specific Maine context, but they're can be applied a bit more broadly. But they're looking at oysters, mussels, scallops, and seaweed as well. And all of this work will be released by the Maine Aquaculture Association in the coming weeks, both through our website and through other places such as the Gulf of Maine Research Institute's Knowledge Portal for Aquaculture, which, if it has not yet been released, I know will be soon. And I'm sure they can answer questions on that. And all these materials are also part of some bigger work we're doing with partners like Focus Maine, CEI, GMRI, looking at farm and business risk management, including crop insurance. And for anyone who has any questions or wants to continue any sort of work with us on this, please feel free to reach out via email. Again, my email is in the chat. And just feel free to connect on that. We're always glad to be talking about it at whatever level that may be. So to kick things off here, our first speaker, who I'm sure many of you may know, but for those of you who don't, it is Sebastian Bell, our Executive Director of the Maine Aquaculture Association. He has more years of experience in the aquaculture industry than he would like me to acknowledge publicly, but I promise you he's very highly lauded in everything. And he will be going over, his background is in really spanning everything from farm management to aquaculture investment. He's been doing this for a long time on many different levels, with many different species. So Sebastian, please feel free to kick it off. I'll get this screen out of your way so you can pop right up for everyone.
No worries, and thank you, Christian. So thank you everybody for taking the time to look at our presentation today. I want to just start by framing the issue, and many of you who are on the call or seminar know some of this stuff, but for those of you who don't, the facts, the underlying fundamentals, as Peter Drummond would say, are pretty simple. Aquaculture is the fastest growing food production method in the world. And it has some inherent efficiencies that will, over time, and as we move forward into a future where our resources are limited and where demand is increasing, will give aquaculture an advantage that a number of other food production methods don't have. It is particularly interesting in Maine because we have some natural assets that allow us to take advantage of the aquaculture production sector as a business sector in ways that other states can't. We have a long coastline, one of the longest in the country. We have incredible water quality. And we still have a working waterfront in this state. Many other states have been urbanized or gentrified to the extent where they are no longer able to develop commercial working waterfronts the way we are in Maine. The Aquaculture Association has for many years, as Christian alluded to, supported the development of aquaculture as one piece of a resilient working waterfront in the state. We are not a silver bullet. We are not a solution that is going to solve all the world's problems, but we are a way that Maine as a state can continue to have a working waterfront and continue to serve our national markets with very healthy, very high quality seafood. And that is recognized in the market in the price premium that we get in the market. We get, whether it's our oysters, our mussels, or our salmon, or our seaweed, we typically get between a 10 and 20% price premium in the marketplace because our products are coming from Maine. And so the Maine brand is worth something. From the association's point of view, much of our focus has been on supporting the development of the Maine brand and ensuring that new farmers and existing farmers are using the most sustainable methods for farming possible. So we have been world leaders in the development of best management practices, in the development of third-party audited programs, so that buyers can know that if they buy from Maine, they are buying a product which is not going to show up on the front page of the New York Times as being a liability as opposed to an asset. And we're very proud of that. We've spent a lot of time and a lot of effort on that, and our growers have spent a lot of time and effort on that. What is most interesting about Maine now, in the last, say, 10 years, is the diversity of our sector. We are not a one species state. We have multiple species using multiple production methods, and we have multiple sizes of companies. We have small companies that are 1 or 2 people, and we have companies which are 200 or 300 people, and we have everything in between. So Maine is quite unusual in the national context in the sense that it has this diversity both in terms of species, in terms of company size, in terms of company form, production method. And what that has meant is it gives us a resilience from a sector point of view that a number of other parts or states in the country don't have the same level of resilience. They may be tending to focus on one production method or one species or one company size, if you will. The other advantage we have in Maine is if you take a 24-hour truck drive from Maine, say Atlanta north and Chicago east, that's 130 million consumers. And so in the fresh seafood market in particular, we have an unusual advantage. As many of you know, most of the seafood which is consumed in this country is imported. Much of it is frozen, and that which isn't frozen is imported via air freight. So from a cost point of view, from a shipping point of view, and from a freshness point of view, we have an advantage in the marketplace. And that is part of the reason that we are seeing a price premium in the marketplace. So from an investment point of view, we are attracting investment both from within Maine, but also from around the world. And I'm sure a number of you have heard about the kind of investment that we're attracting in terms of our land-based recirculating aquaculture production methods. We're also attracting investment in terms of other production methods and other species. So Maine is kind of unusual. It's kind of a case study from a national point of view. And that's in part one of the reasons we reached out to Carole Engle and Jonathan Van Senten, both of them people who I've known for a while and respected enormously as economists, both of them who bring an impartial and quite tough eye to economic assessments in a sector. And we reached out to them and said, we want you to do an arm's length assessment of what the baseline is in our sector. And we want you to do benchmarking studies. Benchmarking studies are something that in the aquaculture sector have not been done very often. And from an investor's point of view, many of the times when you look at an investment proposal or a prospectus, if you're in the the retail side of the house or the or in the widget side of the house, you can reach online and find a benchmarking study that gives you some basic measures to compare the performance of what the proposed investment is. There are very few of those in aquaculture. And so when we reached out to Carole and Jonathan and said, we want you to do benchmarking studies on us in Maine, we took a risk because there's a lot of new stuff happening. We're a very young industry, and we recognize that there will be a wide degree of variation in the performance of the companies that are in the sector. But the reason we did that is very simple. We want to know, and we want to be able to provide to our growers and to the investment community what the diversity of performance is in the sector, and then how we can measure improvement in the sector over time from an investor's and a return on investment point of view. And so that's the purpose of this exercise. I want to thank Carole and Jonathan tremendously for being willing to take the time to focus on Maine. They are incredibly busy people. They are both world-renowned, preeminent economists that don't have to work in Maine. They could work all around the world, and they have plenty of work to do. But the fact that they were willing to take the time, look at what's going on in Maine here, and give us a cold-hearted, objective view of where our strengths and our weaknesses are goes a long way. So we are delighted to have them here today, and I will give it back to you, Christian, to organize the rest of this and just say thank you, Carole and Jonathan, both, for your willingness to take the time to look at the Maine aquaculture sector.
Yeah, and I have to say I appreciate that too, and echo pretty much everything you just said right there. I mean, a lot of respect for all the work they've been doing overall, just in terms of economics around aquaculture and the investment and everything. But yeah, to cut right to it, to our second speaker now, Dr. Carole Engle. She's the author of the Maine Aquaculture Financial Benchmarking Studies, along with Dr. Jonathan Van Setten, who is currently the Assistant Director of the Virginia Seafood and Agriculture Experiment Station at Virginia Tech. Carole, who is currently a consulting aquaculture economist with Englestone Aquatics, has dedicated pretty much her entire career to aquaculture research, extension, and teaching. She's earned numerous awards and has served many important roles, including her current role on the editorial boards of the Journal of the World Aquaculture Society and that of the scientific journal Aquaculture Economics and Management. Also, she's recently published her fifth book, Aquaculture Businesses, A Practical Guide to Economics and Marketing, which I highly recommend to anyone looking to learn more about the business of and investing in aquaculture. It really is a great book, and I'll try to drop a link in the chat because for anyone who has any interest in this, it's just an unbelievable reference. And there's a lot to learn from it. But with all that said, Carole, please feel free to get to the most important part of this all.
All right, thank you very much, Christian and Sebastian, for the kind words. And it's good day to everybody on this call. Can you hear me all right? And can you see the slides now, just as a check? All right, great. So good day to everybody listening in, and good afternoon to those on the East Coast, and good day to those who may be farther away. This presentation is divided into two basic parts. The first section, I'll give a brief overview of benchmarking and how we went about this study. Then in the second part, I'll dig in a little bit more to some of the specific sorts of crops and species that we took a closer look at throughout this study. I do want to say at the outset, I do want to thank Christian and Sebastian for all their support. Economics is often a pleasure to do, but sometimes it's not, because sometimes there are certain businesses for which the numbers are not very attractive. And so I appreciate all the support for doing a very realistic job with these data and a very honest, straightforward approach to this project. Benchmarks are a term that we often hear in different places, but I thought it'd be good to start off and provide the definition of what we mean by benchmarks and what we really set out to do with this. We're really talking about a business tool that's used to compare performance, either within an individual business across years, or for one business to compare their performance to other businesses within a similar sort of sector. benchmarks, if done realistically and with good industry data, can be used for an individual business to track its performance and identify certain areas or certain aspects where that business will meet or exceeds or falls below the averages for their type of farm or their type of business model. When one looks at the overall economic and financial performance of any business, there are many different aspects of it. These little bars down at the lower right-hand corner of this slide show a situation where a farm shows it to be profitable, it shows fairly high production, but it shows low cash flow, for example. Poor cash flow can generate all sorts of problems in a business, and something that may need to be addressed in a particular business in that case. So benchmarks, when used and when based on realistic farm level data, can suggest areas of improvement, areas to focus on to improve the performance overall of the business. Are benchmarks used in agriculture? Sebastian mentioned their use in many, many industries. In manufacturing, they're commonly used. In agriculture in the United States, they are used in several sectors. Anyone who would like to take a closer look at how they're being used in some sectors of farmers that run livestock farms farmers can then go in and generate a summary report by year, by state, by crop for the sector as a whole. They can also generate their own benchmark report that shows how their particular business compares to other similar farms in the same state raising the same crop or type of livestock. Another example in the Northeast is that of the dairy farm benchmarks by Farm Credit East. So there are examples in agriculture. These are based on real-world farm-level data that are submitted each year that have been used to great benefit by farmers who raise these types of crops in those areas. Just as two quick examples from the Northeast dairy benchmarks, for example, one of the major costs for many kinds of livestock are feed. So with those benchmarks, among many other metrics that are published in their reports, an individual could look at the feed cost per cow across years, or they could look at their particular feed cost and compare it to that of different farm sizes. So this is a very simple example of the kind of benefits that can come from good benchmarks. Now for aquaculture, the problem is that there are a number of publications that have proposed benchmark metrics and have developed long tables of different kinds of metrics for different kinds of aquaculture crops. There are some studies that have developed benchmarks for what they called a typical farm and compared those out of Europe, but there are very few, if any, that are based on comprehensive farm level values that really represent the reality of any sector. As we know, the reality of any kind of a business is that some farms do better than others in some areas of the business, and some farms do not do as well as others. And so what we could not find is a good example of realistic, comprehensive farm level values that were used to generate benchmarks for aquaculture, especially not in the United States. And so this study really is quite unique in that, to my knowledge, it's the first attempt to really develop realistic farm level values, to use those to develop benchmarks for a sector of aquaculture in the United States. So this really is an innovative and pioneering sort of a study. In order to do this, we wanted to focus on farm level data, make sure that we collected and created as comprehensive a database as we could. And so we implemented a survey to do this. In the survey, we targeted the major aquaculture species in Maine and set out to collect very comprehensive data, both on production practices, production metrics, production outcomes, as well as comprehensive data on economic and financial performance and outcomes. We then used those data to develop a whole series of metrics and ratios that looked at different aspects of business performance. We had more responses from oysters, as you would imagine, because there are more oyster producers in Maine than other types of aquaculture. There were fewer responses from mussels, seaweed, and scallops because there are simply not as many producers in those sectors. Scallops in particular is really quite experimental in Maine. It's developing slowly, but developing production and marketing methodologies and techniques, but it was too small and too variable to be able to calculate benchmarks. So the benchmarks that I'm going to share with you today are for the other groups. One of the aspects of any kind of production, especially with aquaculture, are the inherent risks involved in it. We all know about market risk and price risk, but with aquaculture, especially working in the ocean or in coastal areas, there are additional types of risks. But understanding the types of risks and the frequency of those risks and the magnitude of the losses associated with those risks is an important factor in the feasibility of any business. So in the survey, we did collect information on these different kinds of risks, and we're able to categorize these. The final report and the full report is quite lengthy and contains a lot of detail that will be made available by the Maine Aquaculture Association in the coming weeks. But you can see on this graph, the red bars are those types of perils that were reported by respondents to occur infrequently, but when they occurred would result in major losses. The blue bar was an example of a peril that was reported to occur frequently, but with minor losses when it did occur, and the salmon colored bar was frequent with major losses occurring. So we do have information on the types of perils that were most important to these sectors of aquaculture in Maine, as well as the frequency and magnitude of losses associated with each that are quite important when considering and developing plans for moving forward for expansion or developing new types of aquaculture businesses. In terms of the benchmarks themselves, we spent a lot of time looking at the data, grouping the data, and analyzing the data to look for ways to group the data within similar categories so that the data we would minimize the variability to the extent possible and be able to provide benchmarks that provided support and information. At the end of the day, we ended up with 3 categories of oysters that I'll come back to a little bit later on in the second portion of the talk, but there were sufficient differences between established oyster farmers that were using suspended culture methods from bottom culture methods to warrant separating those into 2 separate groups. The startup oyster farms, as you might suspect, had a number of differences in terms of cost structures and other aspects of the business that warranted calculating separate sets of benchmarks. We also calculated benchmarks for raft-cultured mussels and also seaweed production as well. For the benchmarks, we organized benchmarks into a series of different categories. We clearly had production benchmarks in terms of volumes and of product harvested. We had marketing benchmarks related to distribution channels and product sizes and pricing. We collected information on startup investment costs. We had tables that included expense benchmarking in terms of cost per pound or of product produced or cost per oyster for different line item expenses that are incurred by different businesses, separate benchmarks for total costs for break-even prices and yields, a series of profitability benchmarks, financial benchmarks, repayment analysis benchmarks, and then also a series of efficiency benchmarks related to production efficiency, but also importantly for the species we were really focused on of shellfish and seaweed. Important metrics include efficiency of the use of labor and capital, because labor and capital were quite important costs for these particular sectors. The total number of benchmarks calculated under each one of these categories varied between oysters and mussels and seaweed, for example, because with mussels and seaweed, we felt it quite important to look at a number of different ways of calculating these metrics. So we calculated them per acre, per farm, per foot of total line for mussels, per foot of grow out line for mussels, and in a number of different ways to try to look for which ones would be most useful for individuals to use going down the road. So in all, we calculated just under 450 different benchmarks that were calculated, aggregated across those different groups, although they were calculated for each individual observation and then aggregated to maintain confidentiality of this very important private business information that we were working with. In doing so, we calculated averages. We also calculated medians. When you look at the relatively small sample sizes, economists would love to have sample sizes for any individual group that's being analyzed of 30, 40 observations per cell. There simply aren't that many observations there. And so given some restrictions on sample sizes, we also calculated medians. The variability that's inherent in aquaculture businesses that we see in all sectors of aquaculture is important to consider when evaluating these values as well. So we calculated a coefficient of variation for each one of these benchmarks, and also calculated minimums and maximums and reported those. Then, to try to more fully understand the context and sort out and tease out different kinds of effects, we also looked at cost structures of these different types of aquaculture businesses. We looked for evidence of economies of scale. We spent a lot of time looking at relationships among these various metrics, all 450 of them, with profitability metrics that we measured as net farm income or net margins, and also working capital as a measure of cash flow. The success of a business, of course, is going to depend on profitability. It often, especially for startup business, will depend on cash flow. So we spent quite a lot of time looking for associations between these different benchmarking metrics and these two key variables of profitability and cash flow. You might imagine the report is quite lengthy. There are a lot of tables with a lot of numbers reporting all of these values. There are quite a few figures showing these different relationships. Here today, I'm going to try to just give you a feel for some of these relationships and highlight a couple of key parts, and so that you'll have some idea of where the numbers came from and what we were able to come up with in terms of the total set of benchmarks. Now, in terms of using these benchmarks, it's very likely that producers will use these in slightly different ways than what a lender would use them, because they're looking at things slightly differently. One of the key values is for a producer to use these as metrics that they track, look at their performance from year to year, and see how these change over time, but then also to use these as a basis for comparing their individual farm's performance to that of other similar types of farms as well, to be able to see then those areas where their farm may meet, exceed, or fall below the industry performance. The importance of doing that is that that's what suggests areas for improvement in that particular farm. That can lead to the individual farm setting a goal to work to address that particular area the coming year. I'll just share why this can be so important. Some individuals on the call may know that I have spent quite a lot of time working with the U.S. catfish industry. And at one point in time, a number of years ago, the catfish industry went through a fairly major contraction period. A number of farms did go out of business. Catfish is growing again in the South in those areas, but a number of farms did go out of business. The farms that survived inevitably were those that were monitoring these kinds of metrics on their farms very carefully and implemented intervention strategies early on to address key weaknesses in the business. They did not have formal benchmarks like what we're discussing here, but they had some idea what those performance metrics would have looked like with their neighbors. But those that survived were ones that used this kind of approach to look to strengthen those weaknesses every single year. We think that these metrics may lead to better improved record keeping as well, to better manage the finances of the business. From the perspective of a lender, of course, the lenders are first and foremost making decisions about loan applications and availability of capital and the likelihood of repayment and of those loans. What I do want to point out for lenders is that aquaculture in Maine, as in many other sectors of aquaculture in the U.S. and throughout the world, is highly variable. There are different business models. There are different kinds of strategies that are used. There are different staffing patterns. There are different management practices. There are differing sites that have different performance levels. One farm may do all their own labor. Another farm may hire them out. And so there's inherent variability with these benchmarks. And it's very important to look at the total business model and look at how all of these different factors interact when making these decisions. In the data that we have and the benchmarks we calculated, this inherent variability is sort of compounded by some fairly small sample sizes. So it's important to keep this in mind and look at the variability and look at the ranges that are reported in the reports. One way to look at that variability is to look at the coefficient of variation, the CV, that is calculated in the tables for each of these benchmarks, and to look at the total range of values for each, the minimums and the maximums that are reported. And then finally, it's important that these should be used not as absolute thresholds given the variability, but use as guidelines for making these decisions to help understand the business as a whole, where the strengths and weaknesses are of the business, and weigh in the different factors and the business model of an individual applicant when making these decisions. Obviously, lenders also play an important role as a partner with producers in terms of providing and offering advice for strengthening the finances of business as well, and that's certainly another role that these benchmarks could assist with, because they provide a lot of information related to those sorts of things. And with this, Christian, would you like to open it up for any quick questions right now, or should I proceed with talking about benchmarks for some of the individual species?
I think we have one question here so far, and I think if we can address it quickly, then by all means. They're asking, if they say it looks like a very small number of responses, do you know what percentage of total production it covers? So that was referring to the table you showed in the beginning, showing the individual number of responses for the farms per category.
I should have had that number on the top of my head, but I don't. We had for seaweed, and obviously varies by the different species groups. For seaweed and mussels, it's a fairly high percentage, more than half, I believe. And for oysters, maybe you can help me out with that, Christian. What percent do you think that was? It's fairly high percent.
Yeah, I do not know the number off the top of my head either, and I should, but it was
74%.
74%. Thank you, Jonathan, for oysters. Thank you.
And one follow-up question on that, on risks, can I also ask whether global warming came up in some way? In that context, I believe climate change was what we referred to, but please feel free to elaborate, Carole.
Most farmers, when we think about this, most farmers are very down to earth, and most producers are reacting to the immediate events on their farms. And so if you think back to that slide of perils, weather was number one. And so when you think about weather and changes in weather, and whether that is creating greater or fewer problems on farms, you could well be affected by climate change. But what farmers are responding to is primarily those immediate events that were weather. But in that sense, probably so, because weather turned out to be the number one peril that was identified. To the extent that weather is becoming less predictable with climate change, then that would reflect that.
Great, thank you, Carole. And that's all we have for now, so feel free to continue.
Sure, we'll move on then and start talking about individual species. So these are the species we did look at. We calculated benchmarks for oysters and mussels and seaweed. I'll make some remarks about scallops, but we were not able to develop specific benchmarks for scallops. We started off in the analysis looking at effects of farm size, because farm size frequently has a number of different types of effects of the economics and financial performance of an individual farm. So for oysters, we started out grouping all of the observations together and looked at effects of farm size. And we did see effects of farm size as we would have expected to see from what we know of other types of aquaculture. For example, the largest farms in the sample, in the data that we have, harvested more oysters per acre. The largest farms also harvested more oysters per hour of labor. They all ended up spending less investment capital per oyster harvested as well. And so you can see that the largest farms in the data set were more efficient in terms of overall productivity, but also more efficient in their use of labor and capital resources as well, that are two major costs. Well, that was an early analysis and showed some things, and we spent some time grouping the observations in different ways and looking at them in different ways, and found sufficient differences in the cost structures among suspended and bottom culture methods of established farms that had been in business for more than 5 years, and even greater differences in cost structures for startup farms, startup oyster producing farms, as you might expect. All of the startup farms were using suspended culture methods. So you can see with these cost structures that for the two groups of established farms, both suspended and bottom culture, labor was the major cost, followed by marketing or depreciation in others. But the established suspended culture farms were using proportionately greater amounts of labor than were established bottom culture farms. When you look at the startup farms, the greatest cost was depreciation, followed by seed, followed by labor. So the cost structures are quite different. Clearly, startup farms are investing in the capital that's required to do so, and we're purchasing greater amounts of seed, and so these were proportionately greater costs for startup farms. So with these different cost structures, then the benchmarks were calculated for oysters according to these three different groups. I mentioned that we spent a lot of time looking at associations and relationships among some of these benchmarks and key parameters such as profitability, here shown as net farm income or net margins, and working capital as a measure of cash flow on the farms. We don't have time here today to go through all of them. There are many, many figures in the report, but I'm highlighting just a few parts to try to give you a feel for what all is calculated and what's in the report itself. But for established suspended oyster farms, what you can see here is that profitability, which is measured here by the green line here, was lower on farms that had lengthier periods of time for their oyster seed to reach market size. So we've been able to look at some and identify some of these associated benchmarks that are associated in this case with profitability with a whole series of figures. In terms of recommendations and final kinds of use of these benchmarks, most established oyster farms in Maine were doing relatively well and probably are using farm level data to make their financial projections and decisions, but clearly an established farm has that data to do so and should spend the time each year to take a look at it. Decisions need to be based on monthly cash flow budgets, and established farms, if they're seeking to expand and take out a loan, should be able to produce a 3-year monthly cash flow budget to be able to show their cash flow and when they may need more capital and when they may not. Of course, the other part of any standard recommendation for thinking about additional borrowing is to make sure that the individual understands the level of financial risk. The debt-to-asset ratio is one that is easy to calculate and look at and understand whether the firm and the farm can afford to assume additional debt without getting into a very high-risk situation. Specific to the benchmarks then, the benchmarks calculated for both established suspended and bottom culture oyster farms can be used to compare the individual farm costs with those of other farms in these same categories. In particular, the ones that are important to look at are those of labor and depreciation, because these reflect some of the major costs of production of these specific segments of Maine aquaculture. any other major cost for a particular farm should also be compared with the benchmarks that were calculated for a wide variety of input costs across every different farm to understand why maybe it's a major cost on their farm and not on other farms. Obviously, any costs that are relatively greater as a percent of total cost than the benchmarks calculated would require and merit greater attention to controlling those costs and seeking ways to reduce that particular cost. We also looked at marketing expenses and calculated different metrics and benchmarks related to marketing expenses. These were also quite variable, but with further analysis, looking at those that often depended on the specific business model and marketing strategy targeted by those farms. So a farm that has relatively greater marketing expenses than other farms of a similar size using similar production methods may not be a red flag depending on the marketing strategy. So it's important to think about that and consider the overall business model and strategies when evaluating these based on the kinds of markets that are targeted by specific farms. Interestingly, to me at least, that most of the established oyster farms in Maine that responded to our survey did not borrow capital. Most of them had used equity capital and expanded slowly over time. I've seen this in other sectors of U.S. aquaculture as well. There may be some lessons there to think about in terms of building equity capital and building the experience and moving up the learning curve before borrowing substantial amounts of money. But again, adequate planning will help people make those kinds of decisions. And in this data set, most of the established oyster farms had not borrowed a great deal of capital. For startup oyster farms, there are other benefits of using these benchmarks. The benchmarks do provide estimates of startup investment costs. We also saw evidence of some startup farms for which the benchmarks were showing that they were not profitable. Further analysis of those particular farms showed that they were inefficient in other respects and had higher costs because they potentially were undercapitalized. But we also saw some farms that showed lack of profitability, that showed evidence of higher depreciation and repair costs that were potentially overcapitalized. So there is sort of an optimal level of capitalization where farms need an adequate amount, but not an excessive amount. These benchmarks hopefully will help provide some guidance as to what that level is for startup farms. We also saw in the data that startup farms tended to purchase more seed per acre than did established farms, substantially more. Obviously, that cost them more money, and you may recall that in the cost structure, seed was a much greater percent of total costs than it was on the established farms. It may be advisable for startup farms to not try to expand or start off at too high a level, but use a more moderate amount of seed while they're moving up the learning curve and developing experience raising oysters. Obviously, the benchmarks in looking at input expenses and working capital, it's quite important to use those to avoid underestimating the input expenses and underestimating cash flow problems that are a major cause of business failures across not just aquaculture, but all businesses. Obviously, startup farms as well as existing farms and established farms need intensive cash flow budgeting and careful monitoring of cash flow. The benchmarks can be used very usefully to address those kinds of issues. As the farm gets up and running then, the benchmarks provide a basis for looking at benchmarks such as mortality, survival, harvest quantities per acre, and the time from seed to market. These were benchmarks for which we saw associations with profitability metrics as well as cash flow metrics. So over time, monitoring their farm's performance with these then can provide useful insights for where they may be beginning to move off track and where they are on track in terms of meeting their economic and financial performance goals. I'll move on to mussels. Our time is short here today, and as I said, there's a great deal of information in the report. Excuse me. I'll move on and make some comments about mussels. There are far fewer mussel farms in Maine, and thus we had fewer observations. We did look at cost structures of mussels in Maine, and labor is the major cost in mussel production, followed by repairs. And so in that respect, the cost structure was similar to that of oyster farms. When we began to look at profitability, in this case, we found it more useful to look at profitability here measured as net farm income or net margins per foot of line was more useful than trying to measure, develop these metrics and look at these on a per farm or per acre basis. When we looked at these, you can see from this graph that only one of these farms was shown to be profitable when all non-cash costs were covered. We can have long discussions about non-cash costs, but in the long term, non-cash costs such as depreciation must be covered. The business must generate enough revenue to be able to replace the equipment and capital assets when they wear out to be sustainable in the long run. With mussels, without consideration of non-cash costs, on average, mussel farms were profitable in Maine. When we look at these sizes and looked at economies of scale, we see on this graph that there are indications of economies of scale in mussel production in Maine. It was the largest mussel farm in our data set that was profitable and the others were not, which is one way to look at it. And economies of scale also suggest these data on average costs of production suggest economies of scale as well. That will be important and moving forward in Maine in terms of considering expanding mussel production to consider these, consider the economies of scale. But economies of scale and spreading those fixed costs over greater production was not the only reason why one farm in particular was more profitable. The most profitable farm was also more productive. They harvested 2.3 pounds of mussels per foot of grow out line, compared to the next best farm that was not profitable when all costs, including non-cash costs, were included. The next best farm harvested only 1.3 pounds per foot of grow out line. So there were some productivity differences here as well that are important to consider going forward. Labor as the biggest cost is obviously something that bears watching and bears scrutiny and monitoring in mussel production. Throughout the benchmarks, we looked at labor efficiencies and productivity in a variety of different ways. One metric we used was this one to look at sales revenue per hour of labor. If that's less than hourly wages paid, the farm is going to lose more money with every hour of labor used. So that's one metric that could be used to keep an eye on labor productivity and efficiency that is important with mussels as well. I mentioned we developed a lot of graphs looking for associations, and we're not going to go through all of these here today, but this is one that looks at the association between total pounds harvested per farm and working capital, which is a measure of cash flow. It clearly shows, as one would expect, with more pounds harvested per farm, working capital would be greater. The second graph is looking at profitability measured as net margins or net farm income versus pounds harvested per hour of labor, which is a different labor efficiency metric that we looked at and calculated. But it's clear from this graph that there's an association between the profitability of these bars that measure net farm income with profitability declining as the efficiency of labor use declined as well. So these are important considerations in looking at how to improve profitability and performance on farms. Now, mussel farming in the United States is fairly new. We don't have centuries of experience raising mussels as some individuals do in the European Union, especially in countries like Spain and the Netherlands. There is a report of results of a survey that was done in the EU that collected information and costs and earnings of a variety of aquaculture species, but it included mussels as well. So we did take a look at this, using the aggregated data from this analysis, we were able to develop and calculate some of the same metrics that we calculated in this benchmarking study. So as you see this comparison between Maine and Spain and the Netherlands, this top line is the production per farm on average is clearly less. This provides some additional evidence for economies of scale. Keep in mind that Spain and the Netherlands do have different business models. The market demand is different for mussels in the European Union. Nonetheless, these numbers are really quite different, and I think are bear thinking about and bear some attention. In terms of labor and management, productivity, the pounds harvested of mussels per hour of management and labor in Maine was substantially lower than in Spain and the Netherlands. So again, labor productivity that may be affected by overall farm size is important. The converse of this, of course, is that then labor and management costs as a percent of farm output were greater in Maine than they were in Spain and the Netherlands, and the net income ratio was less in Maine than Spain and the Netherlands. So there's some indication that greater productivity, maybe economies of scale, are important considerations going forward with mussel farming and planning for mussel farms in Maine. Now, I've mentioned briefly some of the benchmarks with seaweed. Seaweed farming is even newer than mussel farming, generally in the United States and including Maine as well. It has a long history in other parts of the world, but this is very much a new crop. Structure for seaweed farming showed that labor was the greatest cost as well, followed by depreciation. Some individuals, and myself included, in thinking about seaweed production, might be a little bit surprised by depreciation being as high as it is in this case, because you think of seaweed as not requiring a great deal of capital investment or equipment, but a boat is required, a winch is required, seaweed is heavy to harvest, mooring gear is required, and buoys and other sorts of things. So there still is a cost that has to be considered. As with anything else, the non-cash costs of depreciation will have to be covered, because sooner or later the portion of that boat, the portion of the winch that's used for seaweed, will need to be charged to the seaweed revenues when it needs to be replaced. So we cannot ignore those kinds of equipment and those kinds of non-cash costs. In a quick look at economies of scale, we do see some evidence for economies of scale. The data for seaweed is even more limited than it was for mussels, so we need to take this with a grain of salt. But there is some evidence here that there are economies of scale in seaweed production. For seaweed, there are a couple of other comments I'd like to make. It still is in a developmental stage in many respects, with markets being developed and different production methodologies being developed. In our data set, only one seaweed farm was profitable for the data that we have. There's evidence in our survey that there are a number of unanswered questions still for seaweed. There's a lot of research going on seaweed that down the road will be helpful. But in terms of recommendations for producers, it's probably best to try out a few lines in different locations first, get a feel for productivity. There were comments from respondents who had suffered total crop losses from seaweed due to a variety of events. This is not unusual in the early days of any industry. I've seen evidence of that in the early years of the catfish industry, the baitfish industry, the trout industry, and so it's not unusual for this to happen. But it's important to keep in mind that this can happen as researchers and extension personnel and producers learn about raising seaweed in Maine and in other states. But that's why, as a conservative economist, it seems to me that it's best to enter seaweed production slowly, not jump in with heavy levels of investment, try it out first and develop expertise. Seaweed does seem to have potential as a secondary income source, especially for fishermen that already have boats and gear. Again, eventually the seaweed revenue will need to cover the seaweed portion of those costs of replacing this. Seem to be a viable source of secondary income. I also want to point out that the survey data now are a couple of years old. And by this year, from the time that we did the survey, the number of seaweed farms in Maine has grown from 8 to 28. total production has increased dramatically from 45,000 pounds a year to about 500,000 pounds per year, which means that costs and scale may also have changed. There are follow-up analyses planned on seaweed in particular that likely are going to be different from these because of the dynamic nature of seaweed there. It's important to keep in mind, though, to keep an eye on labor and capital efficiencies because they are important. A few comments on scallops as we near the end of this. They're being raised experimentally. They're a high-value product with a lot of potential, but they're still in an experimental phase. From responses to the survey and conversations with individuals, labor requirements may be greater. Maybe capital is greater than oysters and mussels. They're prone to biofouling, and they do require some careful handling. So in summary, in terms of this project, Maine has developed the first farm-level, real-world benchmark values for aquaculture. These are not sugar-coated. These were not sanitized to make them look good. These are real-world values, and they show real-world ranges, and they show the real-world risks. And I commend the Maine Aquaculture Association for doing this in a very honest kind of a way and supporting this. For more detail on all of the other metrics that we did not have time to cover and the analyses that were done, you can contact the Maine Aquaculture Association going forward. Very much appreciate your attention today. And with that, if we have time for questions, Christian, be happy to try to attempt to answer any questions that participants may have.
Yep, and one thing while we're doing that, everyone please feel free to jump right into the Q&A and just throw your questions right in there. And while we're doing that, I'm going to jump ahead, Carole, and cut off your screen, sorry, just to go through some of the business and production planning real quick. Sure. And let's see, I'll just pull that up. And all I want to go through here is that full screen? I cannot tell. All right, just briefly, and again, everyone, please feel free to populate the Q&A section. Plenty of questions for Carole, I'm sure, so throw them in there. This is just going over our business and production planning tools, and the idea here was similar to what you've heard throughout all of this. This was very much an industry in transition, even 3 to 5 years ago when all these projects through Focus Maine were started. People were more, say, hobbyists before they were expanding to now more full-time businesses with possibly room to grow. And there was quite little planning. There's a lot of quite impressive, actually, back of the envelope calculations of people doing calculations in their head. And part of the benchmarking work, so all this was done with other institutions as well. And we really wanted to do this and make sure it was beneficial for both the Maine growers, but also for the financing and lending industry. So the idea was to create tools that would allow growers with really minimal effort to plan out their production and their business aspects or financial aspects of their farms. And again, the idea is to facilitate this planning process for growers, but also to facilitate the whole access to capital and make it easier for investors and lenders to know what they're going to be seeing coming into it. So, sorry, a little feedback. So one thing we did here was just make a production planning schedule for this matter. And what we did was we worked with other institutions such as the Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center, GMRI, CEI, and what we did was obtain growth data through that work and through the benchmarking work with Carole and Jonathan in order to make these projections so that people could better plan out how they're going to be growing over the years. And this is especially tricky with a multi-year growth cycle of some of these products. And what we wanted to do, and I'd be glad to get into details with these more with people via one-on-one, phone call, whatever it may be. Here just to give you an idea of some things we're working on or that have been completed. So production plan. Also skipping ahead, we're doing a lot around the business planning, and this was just trying to keep it as simple as possible. Have growers input some assumptions into here, which would then go forth and create, for one component, budgeting. And sorry, it's a little blurry and small. This is just to try to give a bigger picture of what an annual budget may look like based on assumptions that were entered, and provide analysis on both the cost per unit and the cost as percentage of total. And we also did that out with a budget versus actual tracking. And we did this for 5 years out. So to make sure people are really thoroughly planning their business, not only for their own sake, as Carole mentioned, sometimes that can make a huge difference as it did with the catfish farms, but also for when they're approached about, equity financing whatever it may be. And some other tools we included in here are a startup cost and depreciation calculator, just running through this quickly again, a break-even analysis and a sensitivity analysis, along with cash flow projections and tracking. Just overall trying to create a whole suite of business planning tools for both the financial and production sides of the businesses. And this was done, again, through sponsorship with Focus Maine. And at that, after briefly running through that, there's the contact information, which is in the chat box as well. And now, sorry, Carole, back to the questions. It looks like we have a few popping up. And it looks like the first one here is from Toby, and he's saying, sounds like an incredible, valuable survey. Given how nascent the industry is, how often would you recommend revisiting the survey and associated benchmarks? In other words, for an investor, are these benchmarks relevant for the next 3, 5, or 10 years? And Sebastian, Carole, whoever feel free to answer, whoever wants to.
I'll start. I think the seaweed ones, as I understand, is planned, are probably out of date already. Seaweed is very dynamic. I think the answer to that question is going to vary by the species. And so seaweed is changing rapidly in all kinds of ways. So I think they may already be out of date, and I'm glad there are plans to follow up with that. The oyster benchmarks, it will depend on whether something happens to cause changes in those cost structures. That's what it's going to depend on. I don't think any of us understand the long-term effects of COVID, and depending what those are in terms of, we know the effects on markets and things like that. On the cost side of things, I would like to think the oyster benchmarks would be, other than simply addressing some inflation things and things like that, ought to be good for 3 to 5 years, with a caveat of what's going to happen with COVID and restaurants opening up and market demand. Mussels, mussels are more of an emerging industry as well, and so depending what changes there may be, and with additional investment coming in, and if different scales of production emerge, then that would be an argument to repeat those sooner rather than later. And Sebastian probably has some follow-up to that.
No, I think you're right on the money, Carole. I think the one thing I would add is that, and I don't think it's been mentioned so far, is that in the mussel sector, we did not have the ability to generate benchmarks for bottom culture as opposed to suspended. And so, but we know that the economics with respect to bottom culture versus suspended culture are quite different. And so, that was purely a sample size issue, and the fact that we have very few companies that are doing bottom culture in Maine. There are certainly many more companies in other countries. The Netherlands would be a great example of that, where they're primarily bottom culture. Spain is a little different in the sense that they are primarily suspended culture, but they are much larger scale companies than we have here in Maine. And so the mussel sector needs continued benchmarking work in to be able to demonstrate the kind of unique situation in Maine. The interesting thing I think about the mussel data in Maine is clearly we had one company that was doing well and was expanding and growing. We had 3 or 4 companies that were not doing as well. All of those other companies, by and large, were newer companies starting up. And so we caught them at a different point in their development cycle than more established. We didn't have enough companies in the mussel sector, and Carole, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I don't think we had enough companies to be able to characterize them the way we did with oysters, where we had established versus startup. And so we couldn't tease those differences out. But my guess is that's really what's happening in the data.
I think you're muted, Christian.
Yeah, thank you. It's like this is the first time I've done this. So, Sebastian, what you're just saying with the mussels, especially in Europe, Edward McCursey was asking the question regarding Spain and the Netherlands. Do these markets have a large number of companies with small market share, or are there a few very large producers in those markets?
I can start with a report. The report that I saw and cited in this and compared did not have a structural breakdown and did not have a breakdown by farm size. So I don't completely know. What I do know is they had many more farms in those countries than we have in the United States. And that's essentially what I know. I believe there are some large producers, but there are smaller producers as well.
Yeah,
But I
so
don't have direct personal experience with those industries. But they do have many more mussel producers than exist in all of the United States.
there are some fundamental differences between the Dutch and the Spanish production sectors. The Dutch sector has been around since the time of Napoleon, and in fact, our largest mussel grower in the state of Maine, who happens to be a bottom culture grower and who was not part of this survey, is actually the sixth generation of a family that has been growing mussels in Holland, who has emigrated to the United States to start his own mussel farm. So they are the structure of the Dutch mussel sector is quite mature. The Spanish sector, I would say, is kind of in the middle there. They're using suspended raft technology. They are certainly older than the Maine mussel sector is, but they're much younger than the Netherlands sector. And there have been, both in the Dutch and the Spanish sectors, there has been consolidation, not surprisingly, as there are more mature sectors than the Maine sector.
All right, thank you, Sebastian. One question we have, I think, would probably be up your alley, Sebastian, from an anonymous attendee. Can you speak to the use of 24-hour generators and lights in any of these farms as they scale up?
Yeah, so that is often a concern, particularly by riparian landowners, people who have been lucky enough to buy very expensive, very beautiful shorefront property in Maine. And it depends on the operation. We collectively, as a group of growers, are committed to reducing our visual and acoustic noise print. We are the only user group in the marine environment, including recreational user groups like yachting or recreational boating groups, that actually have standards we have to comply with respect to visual impact, noise, and the profile, if you will, of the installations we have. So we have, as an association, we have a set of best management practices, and then there are regulations that we have to comply with that are state regulations. And so those would impact whether it's the use of a generator or use of lights or what have you. The one place that we ask for a little bit of understanding and flexibility around is if we have bad weather or if there are safety issues on a site where people are in danger, then we ask for some understanding about the fact that we may have to use lights or we may have to use generators in order to either secure the site or rescue people or keep people safe during normal operations or during extraordinary operations, during hurricanes, storm events, that kind of thing. But we have to comply with the state regulations around visual impact, noise, and how lighting works on our sites. And those are the only regulations of their type for any marine resource user in the state.
Thank you, Sebastian. And next question we have is for Carole from Kim Hamilton. Carole, thanks so much for the overview. Could you share what was the most surprising finding to you and what questions would you pursue as a next step?
The most surprising finding. You know, the details sort of come to mind. The most surprising finding to me, I think, was the volume of seed that startup oyster farmers were purchasing per acre being much higher than for established producers. That surprised me. I didn't expect that at all. I expected to see unprofitable farms. It doesn't matter what sector of aquaculture I've looked at. There are always some farms that are showing to be not profitable, especially when you account for all capital costs. I expected all of that. I expected a lot of variability. I expected effects of farm size. I expected economies of scale. Those are all common. I think that one of the amount of seed that new people were purchasing per acre being so much higher than that of established farms is the one that surprised me. What was the second part of that question? Was there a second part?
Yes, there was. A second part was, what questions would you pursue as a next step?
One thing I did not mention that I think would be very useful if producers are willing to engage on this level, but we did ask the question, if available at no cost and if managed in an entirely confidential manner, would they be willing to participate in an ongoing database? These benchmarks are really most useful if they're collected annually, because then they're kept updated and they reflect all of the conditions going on. They would reflect 2020 COVID effects, and people would still be able to compare their performance even within the context of whatever's going on, whether it's a hurricane or a pandemic or whatever. The response rate was very high, indicating a lot of support. To me, that would be very useful to follow up to see if they were serious about doing it. Obviously, it has to be set up in a way that would be where the producers would have absolute assurance and guarantees and sufficient protection that their individual data would be protected and maintained confidential. But the FinBin website does do that. And so that to me would be the most important follow-up, is to see if there's real interest and enough producers to be able to do it. If you go on the FinBin website, anybody can register for that. You can even make up a farm and play around with it on a trial. It doesn't enter into the full database. But if you try to pick a state and a crop for which they do not have enough observations in the data set for it to be confidential, they won't generate a report. So the place to start would be with oysters, where there are more producers and more observations, and maybe start small to see if there are enough oysters farmers who would like to participate with it. If so, I think it would be very useful. It'd be a lot of effort to set it up properly, but there are ways to do it, and the organizers of FinBin might be willing to agree to do it.
I just want to chime in and support what Carole just said. I was privileged enough in the early years of the salmon industry in Norway to participate in their benchmarking work that they did on an annual basis. And I still have on my shelves all the reports that were generated there. They were annual reports. They went across all farms. And they were used by the farming community to massively improve the performance of those farms. If we had not had those benchmarks, and if they had not been done on an annual or a semi-annual or a biannual basis, I don't think the Norwegian salmon farming industry would have grown as fast as it would have. It is challenging to get farmers to engage in that kind of an exercise, because they are risking something in their mind. They are disclosing something. But I think the level of participation that we got in this exercise, and the fact that you, Christian, and Carole and Jonathan were so rigorous about the confidentiality involved in this exercise has instilled a lot of trust in the farming community in Maine. And so I think that's a good place to start. And I hope we can find the resources to continue this exercise, because I think it will be if we're able to do it, it will be a very powerful learning tool for the farming community. The interesting thing is, and Carole, you will appreciate this, some of our more established growers who have been around for a long time, who think they know it all, and I'm watching your grin already, they're the ones who have picked up the phone and said, you know, we learned something from this. We didn't realize that that was costing us as much money. So it's not just the new growers, it's also the more established growers that actually have something to learn here.
All right, thanks, Sebastian. We have another question here from David Bennell, and he's asking, he'd like to know who is a part of this overall. I'll see if we can publish the list of attendees. And on top of that, other than the MAA, Maine Angels, CEI, Focus Maine, and GMRI, a great cohort group, of course, his words, not mine. Who are we trying to engage and inspire here? He works with some of the world's largest food companies and food investors, and they know very little about Maine aquaculture. Maine lobster? Yes. Maine aquaculture? No. So the second part of the question here is, what's the vision for changing this and driving investment in Maine? And perhaps, could this be the next webinar topic?
Well, I will take a first stab at that, and I know Kim Hamilton is on the call, and I know she has some thoughts about this as well. The reality is, for those of us who have been in the aquaculture sector in Maine for a number of years, we've felt very strongly about the potential for investment in the sector, and we are seeing that reflected in growth in the sector. The Maine aquaculture sector has grown between 8 and 9% on annual average over the last 20 years, even through economic downturns. We are relatively small, though, by world standards. And so even though the percentage growth is significant, you are absolutely correct. We need to get our message out to the rest of the world about why people should come to Maine to invest in Maine. And that's absolutely something that we are very committed to from an association point of view. I know the state is very committed to it. And if you look at the investment that has come into the land-based aquaculture over the last 4 or 5 years, we have attracted over $500 million worth of investment in state land-based aquaculture. And another measure of the seriousness of commitment to the sector is the fact that Focus Maine, a group of business leaders in the state, chose aquaculture as one of the 3 sectors that they wanted to focus on and begin to tell the story about and support and attract investment to. And Kim Hamilton, who is the leader of Focus Maine, and who has in part sponsored some of this work, most of this work, frankly, has been leading the charge to try to develop and attract investment from outside the state or from inside the state into the aquaculture sector. And I see Kim is there, and she may want to add something to my explanation.
Yeah, Kim, I just took you, or I granted permission to talk, which feels funny to say, but you should be able to unmute yourself if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, thanks for granting me permission, Christian. Yeah, I don't have anything more really to add to what Sebastian said, except that when Focus Maine did a very in-depth assessment of where the high growth opportunities were in Maine, aquaculture really kind of stood out as one of the untapped opportunities for the state. And that's why we're leaning, so heavily into this with our partners at MAA and GMRI and others to really kind of advance this. I think, as Sebastian said, there's a lot of work to do, but I think what we're seeing is really promising. As Carole said, I think COVID has put a bit of a question mark on how fast this is going to move, but I think there's no doubt that the groundwork that has already been laid for Maine, I think the energy that's around this, the greater attention now to marketing, and I think the opportunities that will reemerge around attracting more companies to Maine all bode really well for where the sector is going to go. Thanks, Christian.
Yep, you're welcome. Thank you, Kim.
If it's any objective measure, the agencies which are responsible for permitting and licensing in the state for aquaculture have signaled very clearly that they are actually struggling to keep up with the applications. And so that's a good thing and a bad thing from an investor's point of view. On the one hand, it's a good thing because it shows a lot of interest. On the other hand, it's a bad thing because it means that the permitting cycle, the licensing cycle, is perhaps longer than an investor would desire. And so, from the association's point of view, we are working very closely with the state administration to try to get resources to the agencies that are responsible for those permitting and licensing processes. Because they're having a hard time keeping up.
All right, thanks, Sebastian. And I'm not seeing any more questions pop up here. So, Carole, I'll turn it over to you for any closing remarks you had.
Simply, I'd like to thank everyone for attending here today and thank the Maine Aquaculture Association for the opportunity to work on something that has not been done for U.S. aquaculture before. It's very pioneering, and I think it really sets the bar for other sectors and states of U.S. aquaculture. And I've enjoyed working with you all on the project, and very much want to thank and acknowledge all of the producers who put up with us on a very lengthy, difficult questionnaire and all of your efforts as well, Christian, and seeing that through, but really appreciate the confidence of all the producers who participated in the study and the follow-up questions and all of that. Thank them very, very much.
I have to echo that as well, Carole. Sebastian, any closing comments from you?
Well, I just want to add one comment, which Jonathan has been very patient sitting there listening to all this. But I want to give a shout out to Jonathan. The work that you did on this project was quite amazing, Jonathan, and really brought us to a whole new level. You, in particular, challenged both Christian and I to make sure that the data that we were feeding back to you folks was really clean and honest and clear. And your graphic ability is astounding. We would not be where we were without you. So thank you, Jonathan, for all your hard work.
Well, thank you all for being such a fantastic team to work with. And really, I can't take all the credit. I did learn quite a bit from Carole. So,
so the last piece is, if anybody has any questions that they want to pursue offline, Christian, they should feel free to contact anybody on the panel, whether it's you or me or Carole or Jonathan independently. We're fine with any of that. What I think is most important is that we now need to figure out how to continue this work, because I do think, as Carole has alluded to, it's really quite unusual work. There's not a lot of this out there in the space, and it will serve not only Maine, but it will serve this country in terms of establishing baselines and giving people a clear understanding of what the potential is. There's a lot of buzz about aquaculture, but I know the four of us are all about the facts and the economics and what really is sustainable over time from an economic point of view. And it's this kind of work that will really make that clear, as opposed to some of the buzz and the hype.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you, Sebastian. And thank you to everyone for, as Carole said, for being a part of this study and everyone who helped us get to where it is now. And for everyone who joined with us today and for all the thoughtful questions and everything to get us where we are now. Everything will be released in the next week or two through our Maine Aquaculture website, and most of that will be linked through the Gulf of Maine Research Institute's knowledge portal as well. So you should be able to see it on there, but really please feel free to reach out to any of us on this panel. And I know at least my email is in the chat box, and it's through our website as well. And we will be we'll be posting a recording of this webinar. So look for that as well, and we will be contacting you with that in the future. And to all the panelists, thank you very much. Greatly appreciate all your hard work.
Thank you, everybody.